Hello, welcome back to CJ 213. So, we're going to be looking at chapter 12 today, capital punishment and death row. This chapter really forces us to confront one of the most irreversible powers that the state possesses. That is the authority to take life as a punishment for crime. Unlike incarceration, probation, or even life without parole, capital punishment allows no correction once it's carried out. And I really want to be clear from the beginning. I'm not teaching this chapter as an advocate or an opponent. I'm teaching this as a career correctional professional. Um, I did spend 2 years combined working on death row. Um, so the experience that I have, and it really changes how you kind of look at this chapter. Um, what I offer, well, I'm hoping to add some texture, some gravity, some realism to what might otherwise just feel very like abstract legal doctrine. So as we move through this lecture, just pay attention to how law, policy, public opinion, human behavior kind of intersect, because on death row they collide. So capital punishment is a sentence. Capital punishment has existed since the early days of American colonial history. More than 16,000 executions have been carried out in what is now the United States. The first documented execution was Captain George Kendall in 1608. And this was not about murder in the modern sense. It was about maintaining authority and order in a very fragile colony. And that theme really exists and continues today. So capital punishment's always been about control. It's always been about moral signaling, political legitimacy, and public reassurance. And inside corrections, executions are not philosophical exercises. They're highly regulated administrative events carried out by ordinary professionals doing very extraordinary tasks. So the death penalty in contemporary society. So two forces really shape capital punishment more than any others. That would be public opinion and political support. The death penalty expands and contracts not primarily based on crime rates, but on a cultural mood. Um, Internationally, the U.S. is increasingly isolated. Most democratic nations view capital punishment as incompatible with modern human rights frameworks. Supreme Court rulings now restrict the death penalty to adults over 18. They have to be mentally competent, and first degree murder cases with aggravating circumstances. From a correction standpoint, this means death row populations they're small, they're very highly scrutinized, and most of the times it's very legally complex. So trends show a clear decline in capital punishment. Only 6 states conducted executions in 2022, and the death row population nationwide really continues to fall. Perhaps the most significant, there were 27 people on death row that were exonerated between 2015 and 2022, 190 total exonerations since 1973. Every exoneration represents a point of failure somewhere in the system. Uh, Investigation, prosecution, defense, or jury decision making. As correctional officers, professionals, we're trained to trust the system, and exonerations force us to really confront its fallibility. That reality really weighs heavily on staff that are assigned to death row. So, death row demographics really challenge common stereotypes. So, most people imagine death row populated by serial killers. In reality, nearly half are white, 42%. Um, Half are black, 41%. Overwhelmingly male. Most had prior felony records, but not homicide convictions. This suggests that capital punishment often hinges on case circumstances, not criminal careers. In Illinois, many condemned inmates committed single but particularly aggravated crimes. So research by Cunningham and Vignan reveals a very consistent pattern. Intellectual limitations, poor educational backgrounds, childhood trauma, substance abuse history. Importantly, most death row inmates they're not violent in prison, and that was my experience. Death row was often one of the most controlled compliant units in the facility. Violence was rare. It was obviously it did happen. Maximum security prison, death row, you're going to have violence. It's inevitable, but it was rare not because of fear, but because the structure was absolute. So public support it really peaked in 1994 during a very high crime area. This was marked by fear and punitive policy. This was about the time that I actually entered into corrections. Um, so I really understand these statistics. But by 2022, 55% of Americans were in favor of the death penalty. Even lower with life without parole was presented as an alternative. High profile wrongful convictions and media investigations have really reshaped public consciences. Inside the prisons, executions rarely feel symbolic, they feel very procedural. So, globally, over 70% of countries, that's 102 nations, have abolished capital punishment. The U.S. Really stands alongside the authoritarian regimes in continued use. Iran, Egypt, China, Saudi, they'll still use it. So this has implications for extradition, international cooperation, and human rights scrutiny. So death penalty appeals, um, capital trials are bifurcated. You know, there's a guilt phase, there is a punishment phase, and once death is imposed, the legal journey had just begun. From a housing perspective, death row becomes permanent, a very long term confinement. And we see this in these appeals, the state courts and the federal courts. So depending on what state an inmate is in, um, the appeals process is extremely lengthy. Extremely lengthy. Uh, I I believe, if I can recall, Illinois inmates got up to 9 appeals, and that was a lot. I mean, one appeal could take years. So just do the math. So some inmates will die from old age before they even get through their appeals. So that's why the process in certain states uh, is not real good. Texas, on the other hand, they're contrary to everything. They actually do it right. Uh, they feel that these lengthy appeal processes it just compounds the inevitable. If an inmate is tried by tried by the jury decides that in this capital punishment case that he is guilty and capital punishment is implemented. They want this to be fast because it's very taxing. Use those words. It's very taxing on the taxpayers. Housing an inmate on death row is very expensive. It's almost 3 times more expensive to house an inmate on death row than it is to house an inmate in population. So there are a number of reasons why why the review process takes 10 or more years, and more years is actually probably closer to the truth. From conviction to execution, of course, the error prevention, constitutional complexity, uh, and procedural safeguards Critics call this delay inefficient. Supporters call it essential. From inside, uh, it becomes a lifetime of just waiting. So now we kind of get into the legality of the death penalty. Uh, the constitutionality of the death penalty really centers on the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. So the two questions dominate: is the death penalty cruel? Is it unusual? The Supreme Court has consistently ruled that capital punishment may be cruel, but it's not unusual due to its historical use. And the interpretation really relies heavily on originalist reasoning in historical precedent rather than the moral consensus. The court has repeatedly emphasized that the Constitution does not prohibit punishment simply because it is severe. So discretion. Um, the use of discretion, aggravation versus mitigation. So 1972, Furman versus Georgia. The first major modern challenge came in this ruling. The court ruled that the death penalty, as applied at the time, was arbitrary, it was inconsistent, it was capricious. And importantly, the court did not declare capital punishment unconstitutional outright. Instead, it ruled that unguided discretion violated the Eighth Amendment. This decision really effectively halted executions nationwide. Then we have Gregg versus Georgia and the return of capital punishment. So in Gregg versus Georgia, the court reinstated the death penalty under new conditions. The key requirement was guided discretion. States must clearly define capital crimes. They must clearly identify aggravating circumstances, allow for mitigating evidence, and provide appellate review. This case, Gregg versus Georgia, created the modern death penalty framework that is still in use today. And from a correction standpoint, this ruling really revived death row populations, but under tighter legal oversight. So the use of discretion, aggravation versus mitigation. Later cases shifted focus to who decides death eligibility. Ring versus Arizona. The jury, not a judge, must determine aggravating factors. Hurst versus Georgia. All critical findings in a capital case must be made by a jury. This really reinforces the Sixth Amendment, the right to trial by a jury. Practically, this increases trial complexity. It raises reversal risks, but it definitely lengthens appeals. So, constitutional requirements for capital sentencing. For a death sentence to stand, the court requires full presentation of the defendant's background, a consideration of mitigating factors, clear sentencing standards, and an automatic appellate review. These safeguards exist to prevent arbitrary executions. Illinois ultimately concluded that these safeguards were theoretically sound, but practically fragile. So, administering the death. So the methods of execution and cruelty claims. Most states use lethal injection. Then you have the Baez versus Reese, 2008. The court ruled that Kentucky's protocol was not cruel and unusual. The key reasonings here was that pain alone does not violate the Eighth Amendment. There must be a substantial risk of severe pain. And then Nance versus Ward, this allowed alternative methods in limited medical circumstances. This area remains legally unstable due to drug availability and botched executions. because those do happen. So race and the capital punishment. Race has long been a central concern. So we have McCluskey versus Kemp, 1987. Statistical evidence of racial disparity was deemed insufficient to overturn a death sentence. The court feared opening the door to widespread sentencing challenges. Miller L. Cockrell, 2003, the court ruled that racial bias in jury selection violates constitutional protections. Together, these cases acknowledge racial bias, but limit remedies. So here in this figure 12.1, this kind of really shows the race characteristics of death row executions and victims in death penalty cases. This slide is one of the most important and most misunderstood visuals probably in the entire chapter. It examines two separate but related variables, the race of individuals executed and the race of victims in death penalty cases. These two factors interact in ways that raise serious constitutional and ethical questions. When we look at the data on executions, black defendants are executed at a disproportionately high rate relative to their share of the general population. White defendants still make up a significant portion, but not at levels consistent with population proportions. This alone raises concerns, but the most significant findings emerge when we examine victim race. The data consistently shows death sentences are far more likely when the victim is white. Murders involving black victims are less likely to result in a death sentence. This pattern has been replicated across decades of research in multiple states. In simple terms, the race of the victim often matters more than the race of the defendant. And from a legal significance and from a constitutional standpoint, this creates a major problem. The Supreme Court has acknowledged these patterns, but has ruled that statistical disparities do not automatically prove constitutional violations. Defendants must show intentional racial discrimination in their specific case. This was the core issue in McCluskey versus Kemp. And from a corrections perspective, inside death row, these disparities are not abstract. When you work the unit, you'll see the racial imbalances. You'll hear inmates discuss perceived injustice. You'll watch how legal outcomes cluster among racial lines. Even if courts tolerate these patterns legally, officers see them operationally. So figure 12.2. So death row inmates by race. This kind of narrows the focus. Instead of executions or victims, this graph shows racial composition of death row populations. This tells us who's waiting, often for decades. What the graph shows is that the key takeaway would be black inmates are overrepresented on death row. White inmates are underrepresented relative to the population. Hispanic inmates fall in between, but they are also overrepresented. This pattern remains consistent even as overall death row populations increase. So why this matters legally? From a constitutional standpoint, this data raises the question: is the death penalty being applied fairly and evenly, or selectively and disproportionately? The Supreme Court's answer has largely been disparity alone is not enough. Proof of intentional discrimination is required. This standard makes systematic challenges extremely, extremely difficult. Court focuses on 10, but researchers point to structural factors, including prosecutorial discretion, quality of defense counsel, jury selection practices, county level charging decisions, victim demographics, political pressure. Each decision point compounds inequality. In Illinois, these racial patterns were clearly visible on death row. Combined with the wrongful convictions, they really undermine public confidence. So this data really play a role, along with cases like Henry Brisbane in convicting lawmakers. And he didn't. I'm sorry, convicting and convincing lawmakers. He did a really good job. He was very manipulative in convincing lawmakers that the system could not be trusted to operate without bias. So, what's the reality? For officers, this graph represents men housed for decades, cells that do not empty quickly, sentences that are legally final but not morally contested. Death row is not just about execution, it is about prolonged confinement under uncertainty, and this graph shows who bears that burden the most. These figures, they don't answer the death penalty debate. Nothing probably ever will. But they do explain why the legality of capital punishment remains very fragile. The law tolerates disparities it cannot correct, and corrections professionals are left to manage the human consequences. So is there a racial effect? The court has acknowledged racial disparities, but still requires proof of intentional discrimination in individual cases. This sets an extremely high bar. From a correctional perspective, the racial imbalance on death row is visible even if legally tolerated. So Atkins versus Virginia, Ford versus Rainwhite. Atkins execution of individuals with intellectual disability is considered unconstitutional. And then Ford versus Wainwright, inmates must understand they're being executed and why they're being executed. Mental competency has to exist at the time of execution, not just conviction. This creates ongoing evaluations for death row inmates. So juveniles, execution of juveniles. Thompson versus Oklahoma. Execution under 16 is prohibited. Stanford versus Kentucky allowed execution of 17-year-olds. Roper versus Simmons prohibited execution of anyone under 18 at the time of the offense. This ruling really relied on brain development science, international norms, and evolving standards of decency. So administrative issues and the death penalty. A death qualified jury excludes jurors opposed to capital punishment. It is a question that will be asked. Witherspoon versus Illinois. It's established limits on juror exclusion. Lockhart versus McCree upheld death qualified juries despite biased concerns. Critics really argued that this creates more conviction-prone juries and less representative juries. Illinois viewed this as a structural fairness issue. And might actually be missing a slide somewhere. So we won't worry about that content at all. So let's just jump right into working death row. So before we talk about executions, we have to understand what it means to work death row every single day. Death row is not defined by execution day. It's defined by routine. It's defined by waiting. It's defined by control. Most condemned inmates will spend years, often decades, on death row. And the majority of correctional officers assigned there will never witness an execution, but they will live with its possibility daily. So the physical conditions and the daily structure here on death row housing is designed for absolute predictability and control. Most inmates they're confined in single cells. They're confined generally 23 hours a day. They're served their meals through the door. There's limited movement, programming, interaction. Cells are sometimes windowless. We actually had open barred cells for quite a while. We had segregation type cell doors that were solid steel. We had some that had perforations in them. So it varies by the state. It varies by the the inmate, whether they're a violent, whether they're an habitual assaulter. So many variables that go into which cell that they're placed in. So it goes back to classification again, even in death row. So they're usually illuminated all the time, monitored by cameras. This is more so now than it was when I worked death row. There was a few cameras on death row, but they were kind of antiquated. Death row and an inmate, it was intentionally sterile, not punitive, but preventative. The goal was not punishment; it was risk elimination. Every movement scripted. Every movement was logged. Every deviation triggered some type of review. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Why did you not stick to the script? This level of structure, it creates safety, but it also will create isolation. So officer selection, training, psychological load, these are all factors. Not every officer can work death row. Assignments typically were based on sometimes seniority. They were based on emotional stability and professionalism. Every officer had to be specifically trained to work death row. You couldn't just get called up in a roll call and say, "Hey, go work death row." You had to be vetted in some way in order to work on death row, because it took a lot of professionalism to work there, and somebody had to be pretty psychologically stable. You should be psychologically stable anyway if you're working in a prison. But officers really have to maintain strict boundaries. They have to have a consistent demeanor. They have to be emotionally neutral. Over time, officers do develop a certain rapport with death row inmates. It's not exactly a friendship, but more familiarity. You learn their routines, you learn their moods, you know their legal frustrations, you know their coping mechanisms. This creates kind of an internal conflict because you're responsible for their safety, knowing that the system intends to kill them someday. When an inmate is moved from execution for execution, moved from their cell house to they get on a helicopter, or if they're transported to the other facility, officers will sometimes feel that sense of loss. They'll have some emotional fatigue. They'll have some moral dissonance, and this is kind of rarely addressed in any type of officer wellness programs. Obviously, there was not a lot of executions, but the times that they did, it was a big deal. It was a big deal when an inmate was taken from his cell. A lot of times, you didn't even know when it was going to happen. This was done to to eliminate the media descending upon the institution, because sometimes they would be taken in the dead of the night when nobody was there, which was smart because you don't want that publicity. The publicity will come when the execution happens. So the execution teams and the shared responsibilities. Execution teams are structured to diffuse responsibility. No single officer performs the execution. Roles are divided into those that are escorting them. There's the strap down team. There's the observation personnel, medical personnel, the administrative oversight. The diffusion is intentional. It protects everybody psychologically. Uh, Execution days that I can remember were very quiet. They were controlled. They were tense. Everybody spoke less. Movement slowed down a little bit. Everyone became very hyper aware. Um, these execution teams, I knew two people that were on the execution team. Two of them that actually worked at my facility. I can't tell you who they are. It's still very confidential. Uh, but I can tell you that they trained repeatedly. And not because the task was complex, but because precision reduced the trauma. The death watch period generally was the death watch period was generally 24 to 48 hours before the execution. During this period, the inmate was under constant observation. We know that their mental health was probably going to be checked all the time. Security protocols, they were tightened. Staff assignments stabilized. Final visits occurred. The attorneys, the chaplain. So these visits were oftenly emotionally charged because officers had to enforce rules while witnessing the grief, the denial, the anger, the acceptance is one of the most emotionally taxing assignments in corrections. And of course, they have their final meal, they have a shower, they'll get their fresh clothing. The chaplain, the warden will be present. Uh, they'll be connected to an EKG. They'll be they'll go through a strap down process. They'll have the word signal, the injection, the administration of the drugs, and then obviously there'll be the medical confirmation of death. Each person focuses only on their task. That's how it is done efficiently. Afterwards, everyone generally returns to their normal duties. Everything has to continue. The shift continues, corrections continue. You have to go about doing your thing. Obviously, the emotional, psychological aspects that comes later. Some people they'll get some type of PTSD from this because you're going to think about it. Like, what was I the one that actually did it? It always goes through your mind, but that's why picking the right people for the death team is so paramount. So to understand death row fully, we have to kind of shift perspective. Working on death row is all about it's all about control. Living on death row is about coping with inevitability. And there's a psychological response of condemned inmates. Researchers have identified 4 types of coping responses. One is maintaining their innocence. Some inmates will maintain their innocence all the way up to death, often very sincerely. These inmates will file constant appeals. When an appeal is expired, nothing goes by, they file another one. They obsess over court transcripts. They resist emotional acceptance. And number 2, the legal fixation. Others devote their lives to the legal work. They memorize the case law. They track deadlines. They live in the margins of the legal documents. And then you have those that have their religious transformation. Many experience profound religious conversion. Faith becomes meaning, it becomes their new identity, and it prepares them for the inevitable. Those that have just come to the reality of they will die, so they want to be prepared for death. Uh, Chaplains really play a crucial role here. And number four, you have the psychological deterioration. You have inmates that become depressed, withdrawn, and just are in despair. Some inmates stop eating. Some disengage entirely. I saw, and I can often predict an inmate's mental state based on their routine adherence. If they break that routine, you know something's wrong. So we now get the impact beyond death row. Um, Executions today rarely disrupt any general population. Most states separate death row housing. This is very common. It actually became a sense of cruel and unusual punishment to house a death row inmate in the same facility that he was to be executed. That that is kind of cruel and unusual. That is very psychological. So Illinois was definitely one of those states where you could not be housed in the facility that you were going to die. Um, so executions, yes. So the location of execution, it's set apart from general population area of the prison. That is also 100% true. Um, and after executions, so shifts felt heavier. That silence kind of lingered. Officers sometimes reflected privately. They talked with each other, the ones that actually worked alongside them. Death row leaves a mark. Um, Not loudly, but it is definitely permanent. So, oops. So arguments for and against the death penalty. So the retentionists will argue that it has a deterrent value. They argue that it is a fair punishment, that life imprisonment does not protect society, and there is the threat of recidivism. The abolitionist arguments, they argue that it's morally opposed to state-sponsored homicide. Then they have the constitutional concerns, pragmatic issues, possibility of errors, and the cost. Like I said earlier, I am not here to defend one argument or the other. Uh, I do have a view. I will be more than happy to discuss that view with you. I do not want to put it in the lecture uh, because I don't want anybody to be biased by how I feel about the death penalty. Um, you may be surprised of how where I fall, um, because I have what you see listed here. I have additions to this for my own personal view. I will be more than happy to talk to you about that, but I don't want to sway you one way or another because that's not what it's about. What this is about. This is about you understanding um, both views. It's about you understanding the legality of the death row, uh, what what the cost is, not just financially, but the emotional, the psychological, mental. There's so many different variables that go into this. Uh, Death row is not defined by violence. It's it's defined by the waiting. It tests the moral authority of the state, the psychological resilience of the staff, the limits of justice, uh, and as correctional professionals, we don't get the luxury of abstraction. We live with We live with the law that's written, the people as they are, the consequences as they unfold. Ultimately, the system demanded more certainty than humans can provide. And your role is not to decide the debate, but to understand, like I said, the weight. And and as I will reiterate, um, you're to understand the weight of it. You are to remain fair. You are to remain firm. You are to remain consistent. That's if you can do that, you will go far in this field. So I do thank you for walking through CJ 213 with me. I have given you a lot of information throughout this course, but as I said, if you choose to go into this field, knowing how corrections functions will help you better understand life in front of the bars and behind the bars. So again, I thank you very much, and I hope you have learned a lot um, uh, as going through this and putting together these PowerPoints, reading through the book, putting the quizzes together. Uh, I've actually learned a lot more than I thought I would. I thought, well, I know this. I am the subject matter expert in this. I can't be taught anything else. I have learned a lot through this with you. So again, thank you, and you have a great day.